Can you imagine your entire world just changing in an instant? Well, that was the reality for millions of Americans right after the Civil War. So today we're diving into Reconstruction, this incredible period where for some people, life as they knew it was completely over, and for others, it was just beginning. To really get your head around this time, you have to understand that there were these two profoundly different realities happening at the exact same moment. For white Southerners who had built their entire society on slavery, yeah, 1865 felt like the end of the world. But for the 4 million newly freed African Americans, it was the absolute incredible beginning of a new one. So let's start with that first perspective, the view from the top, the white planter class. Think about families like the Dubose family in South Carolina. They're coming home from a war they lost, only to find a world they didn't even recognize, a world they definitely didn't control anymore. And this quote, wow, it just captures that immediate shock. This isn't someone looking back years later. This is the raw feeling of a society in total freefall. When Susan Jervey writes about sad subjugation, she's talking about this deep, profound sense of disorientation, of loss. So, what triggered this total collapse? Well, for starters, all that Confederate money, it became worthless paper overnight. Just poof. Fortunes were erased. And then, the big one, the most fundamental thing, the basis of their entire economy, enslaved human beings were now free. This wasn't just some social shift. It was a financial bomb that basically vaporized the South's entire economic structure. Okay, now let's flip the coin completely. For the 4 million formerly enslaved people, this very same moment of collapse was a moment of just absolute joy. This was the dawn of a brand new world, a moment they called the Jubilee. This quote from the WPA slave narratives, it gives us such a powerful window into that feeling. I mean, can you even imagine? After generations held in bondage, you hear the news that you are free. They called it the Jubilee, a word with deep biblical roots, meaning this year of emancipation, of restoration. This wasn't just some political announcement, It was a deep spiritual release. So what's the first thing you do with this freedom? Well, the first priorities were so fundamentally human. People walked, sometimes hundreds of miles, just to find family members who'd been sold away from them. They chose their own last names, which is such a powerful act of defining yourself. And, so crucially, they started their own churches, which almost immediately became the absolute center of African American community life. But here's the thing. You can't just flip a switch and go from a slave economy to a free one. The South had to be rebuilt, but it was being built on really fractured ground. And that led to all these messy, really complicated new systems for labor, money, and politics. The main economic system that popped up was something called sharecropping. And, on the surface, it seemed to make sense. You had landowners who had plenty of land, but no labor, and you had millions of freedmen who had their labor, but zero land. Sharecropping was the system that brought those two sides together. But the promise and the reality, they were two totally different stories. In theory, sharecropping was supposed to be a step up from slavery, right? A path to maybe owning your own land one day. But in practice, for so many, it just became a trap, a cycle of debt that, well, it wasn't slavery, but it was a long, long way from real economic freedom. So how did this trap actually work? Well, the landowner would give the sharecropper seeds, tools, even food, but all on credit and at crazy high interest rates. So at the end of the year, after the landowner takes his half of the crop, the sharecropper would often find out they owed more for all those supplies than their half of the crop was even worth. That forced them to stay another year and another just to try and pay it all off. And while all this economic turmoil is going on, there's this massive political revolution happening. You've got federal troops in the South to enforce the new laws. African American men get the right to vote and even hold office for the very first time. I mean, this was a radical shift in power, and it was met almost right away with just intense and very violent resistance. So at the end of the day, this whole period left behind two very different legacies. How this era is remembered really depends entirely on which side of the story you're on, the world that was lost or the world that was gained. On one hand, you have the lost cause narrative. This was a story that really helped white Southerners deal with their defeat. It basically reframed the war as this noble fight for states' rights, and it deliberately downplayed the central role that slavery played in everything. But on the other hand, you have the emancipationist legacy, which celebrated freedom and focused on building the things that would sustain the Black community for generations: churches, schools, families. And that leaves us with a final, really big question. Reconstruction might have ended over a century ago, but these two powerful, competing ways of remembering the exact same piece of history, they didn't just go away. They've been passed down, shaping everything from our politics to our textbooks to the monuments in our town squares. So the real question for us is, how do these legacies continue to influence the world that you and I are living in right now?